this book interested me and also moved me quite a lot. So as you can probably hear, I grew up in Germany until I was 17, and I moved to this country. I grew up in Berlin, actually, and so I know most of the streets, literally the corners described in that book, which is today's Berlin, very different Berlin from the 30s. I happen to share the first name and last initial with the author, which is also very strange. And the book, to me, is sort of in this kind of canon of literary works from the 1930s, where mostly Jewish authors are trying to account for what is happening in Germany or the rest of Europe, mostly in Germany. And there's a couple books, a couple plays. Bruckner, he wrote a play in 1933 called Races, which the Classic Stage Company in the East Village, under the direction of Barry Edelman, premiered in 2001, before 9/11, which the playwright Ferdinand Bruckner wrote in 1933, literally in 2 months after Hitler came to power, to talk about what happened to his friends before he was forced to emigrate. And so The Passenger is also a book of someone who is trying to make sense very rapidly of an entire world that has disappeared in a certain way, or you could say has turned against him in a certain way. As a German assimilated Jewish kid, Boschwitz grew up in Germany, then realized suddenly he's not considered as open as he thought he was. And there's a part of that kind of psychological crisis of someone who's realizing he had assumed to have been tolerated or accepted, and then the world turned against him. In a way, this book is then about how someone and why someone writes literature. And I thought something I'd love to hear from people about, and people, maybe you have your own experiences, and we always bring our own experiences to this work. I worked for several years at Yale University's Fortune Archives for Holocaust survivor testimonies. My late advisor, Jeffrey Hartman, who himself had escaped Nazi Germany as a child, as a Kindertransport to England, and then became my advisor much, much later at Yale in the 1990s. He started what was then the largest archive of Holocaust testimonies in the United States before the Spielberg Foundation started Shoah. So at Yale, the Fortune Archives. And I had a lot of conversations with Jeffrey Hartman about that. What is the relation between literature and testimony? So this book is a kind of an act of witnessing to history. And it's a way, I think, for us when we read it today, and I read it and I said to Michael, after 5 pages, I was totally gripped by the plot, what unfolds in the space of maybe 2 days or so, 3 days, whatever the plot, the time of this book is, to understand that what I think Boschwitz is trying to do is to open up time to give us this experience for several reasons. One is for people to read this book. He published it in England. I mean, after he died, as you know from the kind of the introduction, he died tragically after having fled to Australia, and he was trying to come back to England to fight in the war against the Nazis. So he was trying to recruit it back as a really recently remade citizen of England to come back, and never made it because a German submarine torpedoed the ship he was on and sank all those civilian passengers. So a kind of tragic story of someone who made it out and then didn't make it out and died really young. So this book is trying several things. It is trying to appeal to the conscience of the world and giving a human face and a human dimension to what is happening in Germany, clearly. To get that book out, that's one of the purposes of literature. But today we read it in a different way, because today we know the terrible outcome and that things got bad and then worse and then worse and then worse. So we read it with kind of historical hindsight from our experiences in 2023, and we think, okay, what is happening in this book that is gripping me so much? What is happening is that what I think Boschwitz tried to do, which is quite common in the 1930s and 20s and 30s for novels, he tries to open up space to say, what is happening to an individual who has to make sense incredibly rapidly of a world that is completely changing in front of his eyes? And what is changing is that for Otto Silbermann in this book, who is a very established, as we would today say, assimilated Jewish businessman in Germany, married to a non-Jewish woman, successful, wealthy, with a business partner, that very quickly, within the span of a day or two, everybody turns against them. And I think we could talk a little bit in this hour we have today about what does turning against somebody mean. It's to treat people with indifference, to turn your eyes away, to look away, to ignore what's happening in front of your eyes. And this is story after story we have from Germany in the 1930s, where people realize what is happening to their neighbors, to their brothers and sisters-in-law, to their boyfriends, their girlfriends, to their cousins, their business connections, their doctors, their shopkeepers, the flower girl down the street, the guy who sold you the newspaper, the guy who brought your kids to school. Suddenly, all these horrible things are happening to these people, and most of Germany, meaning non-Jewish Germans, are looking away. They're just deciding not to pay attention. They're seeing everything, and we have countless stories that everybody saw something and pretended it didn't happen. And Silberman is trying to make sense of his world, where he's, at the one hand, becoming hyper visible, growing increasingly worried and anxious for good reason that he will be outed as a Jew among Gentiles, although he can pass for non-Jewish looking. That's a very important plot point in the book, whereas other people he's been friends with will be outed immediately and identified as Jewish by look. And he's realizing he's become hyper visible, has to be incredibly careful because there's huge risk for him after his apartment has been, brutally attacked and invaded, and he barely escapes. And at the same time, he's become invisible. And I think the book wants to stay in that space for somebody who's totally visible, constantly under surveillance, cannot be located, cannot go into his club anymore, the restaurant, the train, the hotel. He's constantly thrown out because he's noticed as soon as people hear his name, he's Jewish, they can't have him anymore. And also he realized the people who could help or care for him looking away. So I think what a novel is trying to do is to open up time to kind of account for all of these things, which in real live time, people don't have time to account for. His mandate from now on, Silberman, is pure survival. He just has to survive. And he's, in a way in which the book is remarkable, and I wonder what people thought reading it, he seems at moments to be a bit slow at grasping what is going on, because he's holding on to principles, to a moral code, to honesty, integrity, to how you're supposed to behave, that seems completely have been swept away by this tide of fanaticism, like a kind of collective hypnosis, and I would say this again, deliberate indifference, studied indifference on the part of the Germans around him, the non-Jewish people around him. They don't want to know what they're seeing. They're seeing everything in front of them. They just want to turn their eyes and ignore him. And there's that moment with his business partner where he keeps on saying to his business partner, Becker, who he kind of brought up and raised up, and they had been in the military together, and he's stunned and shocked that Becker is totally betraying him, has robbed him of his fortune, and says, well, you're lucky I'm not turning you in right away to be arrested and put into a concentration camp. And Silberman is completely preoccupied to saying, but you cannot do this. You blackmailed one of our clients, a Jewish client. You blackmailed them. You did something dishonest. You're compromising your morality. And you're thinking, at this point, Silberman is still appealing to a moral code that no longer applies to him. And there's a sentence when he says, just because people commit crimes against me does not allow me to turn into a criminal. Just because people are evil does not allow me to cut corners morally. And I think what's interesting about this book, and Ulrich Baer probably modeled this a bit on his own father. There's a kind of, he's the young man, he's maybe the young man in Paris, Edward, the son who can't help, who's being appealed to constantly and kind of being blamed for not helping. I think he wanted to give us a character who's not likable or unlikable, but who's responding as a human being with the resources he has available, which is his upbringing, assimilated, kind of Jewish culture, married to a non-Jewish woman, very German, a kind of very, very rigid moral code, which Germany up to this point is known for, a kind of Kantian ethics, kind of these kind of moral laws within us that we have to adhere to, even when no one is watching, a kind of internalized sense of being a person in the world is being someone who's honest and treats others with respect. The fact that the people who taught him all of this have completely betrayed those ideals doesn't make him betray them right away. So in some ways, where he becomes unlikable or unsympathetic is, I think, where he's almost lagging behind the history that he's living through. He's still adhering to a worldview that has completely been abolished, and he's not quick enough. And I'd say two more things, and then I'll stop for a moment, because I'd love what people want to come in or add what your responses were. two things to think about this book, I thought were useful for me. In the 1920s, you have two major books of world literature, James Joyce, Ulysses, and Virginia Woolf, Mrs. Dalloway, that Boschwitz probably knew about because he was very Anglophile, he spoke English, and Woolf was considered not the superstar novelist she is today, iconic, but she was considered one of those stream of consciousness writers. And people say, oh, but it was written by Virginia Woolf. She's pretty good. She's married to Leonard Woolf. So Woolf was not what she is today for us, one of the greatest writers in the world, but she was well known. In Mrs. Dalloway, Miss Virginia Woolf gives us the day in the life of an upper middle class woman in London who wants to have a party and encounters Septimus Smith, who's a war veteran who will commit suicide. Something terrible happens. Something of historical significance has happened, which is the war. And Virginia Woolf says, I'm going to focus on the psychology of one person for one day to give you the whole picture of all of Britain at that moment. And 4 years before that, 1922, Joyce publishes Ulysses, which is the day in the life of Leopold Bloom in Dublin, who spends an entire day, 24 hours or whatever, 20 hours, and models it on Homer's Odyssey. And Michael and I talked on Monday, and he said it reminded him a bit of the Odyssey, of someone who's been cast out of his home, trying to bring some justice. And meanwhile, his wife is exposed to enormous risk, and his son is trying to save him. And that's what the Odyssey plot is, with the terrible difference. And we get to that, the ending is different. But both Joyce and Woolf are trying something which I think is happening in this book, to give you a glimpse of historical forces by giving you the kind of sort of almost hourly account of what someone is experiencing in the span of a very short amount of time, 2 or 3 days or so. Virginia Woolf is in one day, Ulysses is in one day, Mrs. Dalloway is in one day. This is a book that takes place in 2 or 3 days. And you're thinking, he's trying to account for all of history. And what he's trying to balance out is to say, what happened to all these people, which we know a lot about today? We didn't know very much at this point at all. And as you know, many countries also turned their backs on lots of people. I mean, he tried to get to England. He was shipped to Australia. In my personal history, I'm German and I'm not Jewish, but my grandmother's sister married a Jewish man in Berlin, and they tried to get out and were denied visas to the US, to Australia, and never escaped. And bizarrely enough, my uncle was in some ways lucky enough, and he was arrested and tortured and dismissed. And my great-grandmother hid him until the end of the war for 6 months, and he survived in Germany, which is completely astounding. And then after the war, he finally got a visa for Australia. But he's in the situation of Silberman. He was caught and couldn't get out. And so there's a kind of moment of he's trapped here. He's trying to get somewhere. He's circling around Germany, which I think is a really kind of haunting metaphor, to think someone, there's no more way out, and he just tries to get himself from train to train to train to sort of escape from the people he's been surrounded by. And maybe I'll stop right here to sort of say, this is, I think, an attempt to open up time. As I said, from these 3 days, we see much greater forces. What is unraveled, and I think one of the questions I would have, and I'd be curious what you think, and I think about these kinds of questions quite a lot. I wouldn't say the world fell apart for Arthur Silberman. I would say, what happened to his sense of the world, meaning the kind of network of relations we have and the meaning we give to the kind of society we live in and the people we like, we dislike. Sort of, what is the world for us? The world in the sense of not the globe, not the planet, but the world that is meaningful to us, all the people who we relate to, which includes lots of people who may not like us. But that is also the world. The people, as Hannah Arendt said after the war, much later in the 60s, we always knew we had enemies. As Jewish people living in Germany, we always knew we had enemies. People were used to that. But this was different. And what she meant was, this wasn't enemies. People didn't like you. They're racist, they're anti-Semitic. You can deal with that. You put up with it. You try to fight it. You try to battle it. She said, everything, every relationship we had was now overdetermined by this kind of thinking. She said there was nothing, no space anymore that was free from that. So she said, until then, you had a moment, you had a run-in, you had an encounter. There was someone who was horrible, someone who was anti-Semite, you could fight it. But the entire world was transformed with him in it. And I think that's what novels try to do, to say from the perspective of this person, what is his world now? So his world has been altered and changed. And I think what that book does really well, it says it is altered and changed one person at a time, one decision of a time. The guy whose mother is the housekeeper or the superintendent of his building, who turns away and kind of disdainfully says something. The guy at the police station who says, I'll cut you a break because you served in the military, at the very end of the book said, I'll let you walk out, and he doesn't do that anymore. The woman on the train who he confesses his whole story to because he finds her attractive, completely irrational and utterly human. He hasn't spoken to anybody in 2 or 3 days. He's totally panicked, and he says, okay, I'm just going to tell you my story right now. And she sort of says, oh, well, okay, that's a story, and we won't have an affair for other reasons, but you're being a Jew, that's sort of how it is. So these moments, which I think remind us that what we call history and what historians tell us, and that's why I teach literature and not history, it's one person at a time, one sentence at a time, one person turning away, not offering help, one guy in a hotel being rude, one guy turning him out. And it's these kinds of small actions that make up what we call history. It's not that the Nazis up here all decided what to do. They did. That was horrendous, awful, catastrophic. But everybody on the ground who didn't have a policeman behind him, who acted voluntarily, suddenly in a mindset. That's what Hannah Arendt meant. She said, we knew we had enemies. We didn't know this could happen. That an entire people can suddenly reshape how they thought about us. And every action they took was now dictated by this mindset. So I think this is what the book gives you, that it's individual actions and decisions that matter, that people are caught up in history and make decisions that we would consider, with the terrible benefit of hindsight, irrational, unreasonable, unsympathetic, foolish. Why is he doing this? Why isn't he doing that? It's like watching a movie and saying, no, 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 don't open that door. Right? Think, don't. Why are you doing this? But I think here, because you know the weight of history on him, I think literature does one thing for us that's very important. It allows people in that moment to still have the belief in being able to make a decision, that not everything is overdetermined. It opens up a space that is totally useless politically. That's not going to help us to think what Silverman would do. But it is very useful and important to realize that in those decisions, when something happens, there's no time to reflect and think. So when I watched and transcribed a lot of Holocaust testimonies, deeply moving accounts, which have been used by historians, some of them. And I remember Jeffrey Hartman, my advisor, saying to me, he said, the only reason we have poetry in literature is because it gives back time when people have no more time. When the stormtroopers or whatever, the Gestapo is at their door, they have no time to respond. He said, literature opens up that space again retroactively to think there's time here, and they made decisions, which in a way we can say in a different way, it humanizes them who don't need humanization. We all know they're human, but it gives them that space that they were deprived of because they could no longer respond like somebody who has choices. They were just put in these kind of choiceless decisions. So because this is a book club and not a lecture, I think I'll stop for a moment, but I would love to hear what people thought, or, Michael and I talked a bit, and how you, someone is in Brazil. Thank you so much for saying hi in Nebraska. I'm really happy to hear people from all over the world. I just translated Stefan Zweig's last story, chess story, as Michael said, who, of course, made it to Brazil from Nazi Germany and wrote a really gorgeous book about Brazil. But I would be curious what you thought, what your reactions were, or what moments felt. And I think this kind of challenge as a reader to not go into the position of also judging him and saying, why are you doing this? You should be doing that. This is idiotic. Why are you lugging the suitcase through the forest near Belgium? Let the suitcase go. Drop the suitcase. Don't take it with you. And you're also saying, not what would I do, but it makes him terribly human. He's thinking, no, it's sort of, I got it here. Anyways, it's so heavy. My money is in there. And everybody's like, leave your money. You'll be caught. It'll be foolish. All you need is a life. And we cannot, I think, as readers, put ourselves in this position of, we are historical judges. We know how bad it'll get. You should drop that suitcase. That in some way is sitting in judgment over a character, as if that character should have known more than we do. He knew as much as he could. So I thought maybe I'll stop right here, and if people want to, I'd love to hear what people.
No, thank you. Thank you. That was a great introduction.
Please like and subscribe to receive more content from the Leo Baeck Institute.